Good to see each and every one of you here this morning. It's a wonderful day that we can come together and remember the great love that Jesus has for us. Our hearts go out to several who have lost loved ones recently, like Susan and Jennifer and now Shelley. And let's be sure and keep them all in our prayers for God to comfort them and strengthen them during this time. There's one chapter after another when you come to the book of Leviticus that talks about worshiping God through animal sacrifices. There are burnt offerings, there's grain offerings, there's peace offerings, sin offerings, that is sin that you don't even know you committed. And there's also guilt offerings. And all of those offerings were meant to stress to people how terrible sin is. To stress that, how terrible sin is. God's purpose for Israel was to show other nations how to live in holiness. In other words, how to experience how good life can be. This book has a myriad of laws, and tucked within them is one that Jesus emphasized. He answered the question, what is the greatest commandment? And he answered it from Leviticus chapter 19, also from Deuteronomy chapter 6. He said, according to Mark, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength. The second is this: love your neighbor as yourself. There is no commandment greater than these. And so that's the one that is tucked right there in the middle of Leviticus chapter. We come to chapter 19. We find that as you go through this book, and the reason I'm bringing up Leviticus is if you look at the bulletin, you see the scripture reading, we're in Leviticus now. So you look at it, and you find that it mentions holy or holiness 152 times. But we also see that as you go through it, you also see that sin or being unclean is mentioned 194 times. The law was given to guide people for holy living and as a path for keeping us as far away from sin as possible. God knows sin is not something you take casually. It's certainly not constructive. It's rather destructive in a person's life. Sin, and we see it. How many times it's used? How many times holiness is used? Moses was to speak to the entire assembly of Israel and say to them, be holy, because I, the Lord your God, am holy. There's a passage that Peter writes. He's quoting from Leviticus 19 when he writes in that first letter to the early Christians who are facing all kinds of hardships and struggles. He says, therefore, prepare your minds for action. Be self-controlled. Set your hope fully on the grace to be given you when Jesus Christ is revealed. As obedient children, do not conform to the evil desires you had when you lived in ignorance. But just as he who called you is holy, so be holy in all you do. For it is written, be holy because I am holy. And so holiness is seen in how we live and what we do. One man said, if I had any extra money, I would give it to the Lord. But I just have enough to support myself, my family, pay the bills. And if I had any extra money, I'd give it to the Lord. He said, if I had any extra time, I would give that time to the Lord. But I am so busy with my job, busy with my family, busy with clubs, and I just can't find a second to spare. But if I did, I would give it to the Lord. He also said, if I had any talents, if I could sing lovingly, if I could, lead people, if I had the skill to teach, I'd do it. I would do it for the Lord, but I just don't have that. And so isn't that something? That this person wouldn't be able to do anything. He just doesn't have enough money. He doesn't have enough talent. He doesn't have enough time. Well, isn't that aren't we all kind of confronted with those kind of challenges? Does that mean that all of us are exempt from being holy? Does that exempt everyone in the whole world who is poor from being able to be holy? Well, one of the things that you find about being holy is the way that we conduct ourselves. And one of the ways you find in Leviticus chapter 19, where he's really talking about being holy because I am holy, one of the ways is through generosity. And I was just reading about this man, a homeless man, who made a donation to the Oregon Historical Society just a few days ago. That there was a riot in Portland, Oregon. Can you believe that? There was a riot there. And they damaged the museum of the Historical Society there. They knocked out some windows and also damaged some of the articles of history that were in there. And so this one man, he decides he's going to write a note on a napkin. He writes it. And he said, hello, I'm homeless. So I don't have much to give you, just some of my bottle collecting money. But I saw your windows got broken and I wanted to help. You must give me a free tour before the pandemic. So this is a thank you. And what was it? $1. $1, but it was a lot to that man. A lot. The director says that they've received donations all morning towards repairs for the museum from the riot. But none of them were more impressive than from this man. He said that they have received millions of dollars in donations. But this one stands out as the most impressive. No donation means more to me in the society than this $1 donation from Oscar. So thinking about that man who just doesn't have enough money, he doesn't have enough talent, he doesn't have enough time and all that. Were those reasons, or was that just an excuse that the man was giving? The Lord said to Moses, speak to the entire assembly of Israel and say to them, be holy, because I, the Lord your God, am holy. Well, what is holiness? Holiness, as we've already said, is not determined by the amount of money you have or the talent. Holiness involves a person's attitude. And the man who claimed that he didn't have enough money, talent, treasure, any of that, time, that wasn't a holy attitude. But too many people have an attitude like that. There's nothing commendable or different about that attitude. And the literal meaning of being holy is set apart. We're not only to worship, praise, pray to God, love, revere Him, obey His commandments, keeping our thoughts and our actions pure, but also treat others lovingly. When we look at God's holiness, we're to look at it, we're to strive to follow His example. And Paul puts what is involved in doing this in the following way when he writes to the church at Ephesus. He's talking about here the business of the church, the family business, when you think of the church as a family. He says, be kind and compassionate to one another, forgiving each other, just as in Christ God forgave you. Follow God's example. Therefore, as dearly loved children, walk in the way of love, just as Christ loved us and gave Himself up for us as a fragrant offering and a sacrifice to God. Follow God's example. Walk in the way of love. We find that what was Israel's business? What was their purpose? We find in Exodus chapter 19 this, that you yourselves have seen what I did to Egypt, and how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all the nations you will be my treasured possession. Although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words you are to speak to the Israelites. Is a priest's purpose to serve himself? Is that the purpose of a priest? or does a priest serve others? Well, he said this is to be a nation of priests. That means they're not supposed to be just serving themselves. They're supposed to be serving the nations around them. One of the ways you can do that is by example. They were to be an example to the nations around them, an example of holiness. They were the ones who were to worship the one and only God, not idols. We find that Peter says this about Christians. He says that you're a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, of people belonging to God, that you may declare the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his wonderful light. So we are a royal priesthood also. Israel was to be a nation of priests. And so they were to honor God by how they, one of the ways, being a priest, how they treated the poor and the oppressed. We see these instructions in the Proverbs and how Israel was to treat the poor at harvest time. The Proverbs first. Whoever oppresses the poor shows contempt for their maker, but whoever is kind to the needy honors God. That's holiness. Whoever is kind to the poor lends to the Lord, and he will reward them for what they have done. The proverb is talking about people who can't repay you. They can't pay you back financially or materially. But the Lord rewards us. Have you ever experienced it? You're helping someone, and you feel really good about having the opportunity to help someone. That's how the Lord is repaying us, rewarding us. This proverb is like a parable that Jesus says about the banquet. He says, but when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, and you will be blessed. Although they cannot repay you, you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous. Jesus teaches how important this is with his reference to the resurrection of the righteous, which also may imply how being kind, the kind treatment, can make a difference in a person's life where there's a conversion. And it affects their eternal destination. What a reward that would be for our efforts in being kind. And so at harvest time, how was Israel as a holy nation to treat the poor? We see how they were to treat others in the following 3 ways in Leviticus chapter 19. We find that they were to be generous, they were to be honest, they were to be courteous to others. Not to be selfish, lying, or dishonest and oppressive. They were to be generous. And so let's notice that. This is the passage that I had in the first slide, where the statement, the instruction is made that when you reap the harvest of your land, do not reap to the very edges of your field or gather the gleanings of your harvest. He continues by saying this. He says, do not go over your vineyard a second time and pick up the grapes that have fallen. Leave them for the poor and the alien. I am the Lord your God. This statute describes, or gives a description of the 2 chief agricultural products of the Israelites, grains and grapes, and how they were to harvest them. And those who didn't have any land, what the landowners were to do for them. They were to show mercy to the poor and to strangers. And there's different passages in Deuteronomy and Leviticus that talk about how we're to treat others because at one time you were strangers in Egypt. And so being generous with their harvest in helping the poor is holiness. And it's also being a nation of priests because they're serving others, which is what a priest is to do. And so we find that by sharing, it's the real way to combat and overcome selfishness. Another proverb says this, that the generous will themselves be blessed, for they share their food with the poor. So how do we combat against selfishness? It's by sharing. That's how we do it. And so we see that this holiness takes place at harvest time. It's by the grace of God that there is a harvest, that there is good things. We are only stewards of God's land. Whatever we have, we are dependent upon God. And we see these truths in a prayer that David prays. It goes like this from 1 Chronicles chapter 29. But who am I, and who are my people, that we should be able to give as generously as this? They were giving what they could, because someday there was going to be a temple that was going to be built. And he asked for donations, and they kept coming. They kept coming. There was an abundance of them. There was generosity and all of that. Everything comes from you. And we have given you only what comes from your hand, O Lord our God. As for all this abundance that we have provided for building you a temple for your holy name, it comes from your hand. And all of it belongs to you. And so when the people were supplying what was needed to build the temple, David gives in this prayer. He acknowledges that all is God's. We are just stewards of what we have. Everything we have belongs to God. Even our lives belong to Him. Remember, the meaning of Christian is one who belongs to Christ. Tell the Israelites that when you come to the land I am going to give you, that I am going to give you, and you harvest grain, bring the priest a bundle of the first grain you harvest. So in every acre, God intended a portion of the grain to be brought to Him, the first part. And also to leave some of it unharvested for the poor, so that they could gather at harvest time what they needed. The landowner then could realize that he was only a manager of the property, of the land. He didn't own it, really. God owned it. And He was the one that was providing the abundant crop. That's also why they were to give the first grain of what they had, not the leftovers, but the first grain to God in all this. We need to repeat this idea over and over. Repeat it often. That everything that we have is God's. It's actually God's. And we are to manage it. How are we managing it? Are we managing it in a way that is really different than other people? Are we being holy? The story of Ruth is a good example of this at harvest time. Remember that Ruth and Naomi, they had nothing. They were poor. Ruth the Moabitess said to Naomi, "Let me go to the fields and pick up the leftover grain behind anyone in whose eyes I find favor." So she, that is Ruth, went out, entered the field, and began to glean behind the harvesters. And she goes to the fields of Boaz. He was a leading citizen of the town and a distant relative. He's generous with them, following the instructions in Leviticus. And the story leads to even greater significance because Boaz and Ruth eventually marry. And they have a son named Obed. And Obed has a son named Jesse. And Jesse has a son named David. So you can see what this kindness, where it leads, the ramifications of it are. It eventually leads to Jesus Christ Himself. That was the ultimate gift. And so we never can tell where our kindness may lead to people. The next instructions have to do with honesty. The statement is made, when you look at this after generosity, we have honesty. Do not steal. Do not lie. Do not deceive one another. God gives possessions for us to manage. So when people steal, they're taking it from God. What God has given the person to manage. People who steal are focusing on the material things. That's all they're focusing on. They'll steal, they'll lie, they'll deceive to get what they want while they hurt others. We also do not swear falsely by my name. So profane the name of your God. I am the Lord. Well, let's suppose that they're taken to court. And they even swear, they take an oath to God, and that they didn't steal anything. But again, they're just falsely, and they're using God's name in vain. Again, their focus is only on material things, certainly not on holiness. A holy person doesn't treat people in this way, nor does God treat people this way. God is a loving, caring God. And so we find that things are not more important. They're not the most important thing. People are the most important. Many people love things so much that they're willing to use people to get them. And if that means lying or stealing, well, they'll do it. But what they should be doing is loving people and using things instead of using people and loving things. And so the next thing that we see in all of this is this generosity, this honesty, this courtesy that we're to give. This is holiness. I don't know if we think of it that way, but it's how we treat other people is really a major part of being holy. Do not defraud your neighbor or rob him. Do not hold back the wages of a hired man overnight. In those days, and even now in Jesus' time, Jesus tells that parable of the workers who are hired at different times of the day, and then he pays them at the end of the day. Well, this was the example, this was the guidance that was given in the law, that they were to be paid that day that they were hired. Without this pay, they might have children at home, they would go hungry. So the delayed payment was to inflict hardship on a family, and it certainly wouldn't be a courteous, kind thing to do. Remember, this all has to do with being holy. And in Deuteronomy, Moses puts it this way. He says, do not take advantage of a hired man who is poor and needy, whether he is a brother Israelite or an alien lying in one of your towns. Pay him his wages each day before sunset, because he is poor and is counting on it. Otherwise, he may cry to the Lord against you, and you will be guilty of sin. Do not. Going on from there. Do not curse the deaf, or put a stumbling block in front of the blind. But fear your God. I am the Lord. In Deuteronomy, the teaching is put this way. Cursed is the man who leads the blind astray on the road. Then all the people shall say, Amen. Mistreating people who were blind or deaf. Was that holiness? No, that was not holiness. Nor was it being courteous to people. Among the Israelites, treating people with fairness and dignity was the instructions given from God. Everyone is created in the image of God. And remember the proverb that says, whoever oppresses the poor shows contempt for their maker, but whoever is kind to the needy honors God. That's being holy. I was reading several years ago when an author wrote this. During the Christmas shopping season one year, a college student was walking in downtown Minneapolis. Shoppers in a rush filled the streets. As the student waited for the light to change to cross the street, he could hear a tap, tap, tap of a steel-tipped cane coming toward him. The light changed and the people surged around him. The blind young man became confused. The college student offered to lead him to where he wanted to go, and did. Once they got to his destination, the blind young man thanked him. And after he left him, he could still remember the feeling he had. He wished in all his heart that he could have given him back his sight. But then he thought about what he had done, about what he did give him. He did give him a few moments of care, an arm of concern, a kind voice, and a bit of help. You know, people were brought to the temple who were crippled. And one of them was there when Peter and John came. They came to the beautiful gate, and there was this man there. And he said, you know, he wanted alms for the poor, alms for the poor. And Peter said, what I have, I give you. Silver and gold I do not have, but what I do have, I give you. In the name of Jesus Christ of Nazareth, walk. Wow. He didn't have the money, but he had the connection with Jesus to change that man's life forever. And we may not be able to do anything. I know we can't. We can't do that. I've seen so many people throughout the years with physical problems from diabetes primarily, I'm thinking about. The devastating effects of neuropathy, the devastating effects to the kidney, to even eyesight. All of those things are terrible. And I wish I could give them back their health. But you know, and you've seen many situations with terrible health in people, and you want to restore that health to them, but you can't. But there is one thing that we can do. It goes like this. Therefore, as God's chosen people, holy and dearly loved, clothe yourselves with compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. Bear with each other and forgive whatever grievances you may have against one another. Forgive as the Lord forgave you. And over all these virtues, put on love, which binds them together in perfect unity. So we do have compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience that we can give, and how meaningful that is. And Paul prefaces those virtues with the statement that you are holy people. That's what holiness is. It's treating people in that way. The summary of what holiness is found in Leviticus 19:18, where it states, do not seek revenge or bear a grudge against anyone among your people, but love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. And that's what Jesus was saying. What's the greatest commandment? To love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, with all your strength. And the second is this, love your neighbor as yourself. And so that's what holiness involves. Loving your neighbor as yourself. We see this in being generous with people, being honest, being courteous. Holiness is not self-righteous holiness where you look down your nose at someone else with arrogance. That's not holiness. Holiness is generosity, honesty, and being courteous to others. Let's remember that everything we have is God's. Our time, the treasure, the money that we have, the talents that have been given to us. They're all God's. And in appreciation for all that God has given us, let's make sure we use them to honor Him. And in honoring Him, we'll be helping other people. If you're subject to the invitation of Jesus this morning, if you've never met Him in the water,